This is the Listening Tube.
Hello. Thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley. The Listening Tube seems to have caught on in Tokyo. I only have one thing to say about that. Domo. 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 On this episode, we'll hear about the arrest of Mahatma, Memorial Day, and the Indy 500. Plus, we'll hear from an East Texas bail attorney about bail, its value to society, and the effects of bail reforms. But first,
Not the headlines.
there's a podcast host for Colorado Public Radio who lost his job back in January. First of all, I didn't know podcast hosts could get fired. I guess I better watch my P's and Q's. Second, why is Colorado Public Radio paying somebody to make a podcast? Other than that, he was a part-time weekend host. Well, good for him. Until he got fired in January. Did he use profanity on his program? Did he say something that was an obvious lie? No. In a letter to the Democratic Colorado lawmakers, 11 of them, who signed a letter accusing Colorado Public Radio of violating the rights of the former employee, the president and CEO of CPR explained that the former host was fired for abusive and erratic behavior that was witnessed and reported by numerous CPR employees. He then admonished those same lawmakers for spreading a letter around that was void of balance and truth. The CEO of CPR then went on to reinforce company policy by telling the progressive pawns who wrote to him that if their idea of accommodation is to allow an employee to be repeatedly abusive and disrespectful to other colleagues in the workplace without correction or consequence is something Colorado Public Radio will not permit. So the guy was let go for being an ass. No, wait. Before I jump to that conclusion, maybe Colorado Public Radio wanted to get rid of him for another reason. Colorado is a very liberal state, so it's safe to say Colorado Public Radio is liberal as well. Maybe this guy was a Republican. Maybe he was spewing hate speech by saying Israel has a right to defend itself. Or maybe he pointed out that the state of New York versus Donald Trump looks like a total sham trial. Well, no. He didn't do any of that. He just refused to modify his behavior after being given multiple opportunities to do so. But then why did 11 Democratic state lawmakers go so far as to not just support the former employee, but to make a public spectacle out of it? Because he's a darling of the progressive left, that's why. He's considered a liberal success story. His podcast is all about mental health and addiction recovery. He's a recovering cocaine addict himself. He also seems to be suffering from mental health problems as well because he filed a lawsuit against his former employer over his termination in March. He claimed his former employer violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and a Colorado anti-discrimination law, according to a story in the Colorado Sun, for failing to accommodate his disability needs. Disability? Is this guy missing a limb? What kind of disability are we talking about here? Well, maybe we can figure it out by the accommodations for which he was asking. There were 3 of them listed in the article. 1, moving production of the podcast into the newsroom from CPR's Audio Innovations unit because he was clashing with a manager whom he felt was hostile toward addiction recovery. 2, resources to cope with a stressful work environment, including the station's financial struggles, from the head of Human Resources, who promised to provide that assistance. I was often telling CPR leadership that the issues going on with the morale, that it was affecting my mental health. It was affecting my ongoing recovery, the former employee said. If you know anything about addiction, the one thing that you learn in recovery is you have to recognize triggers. Unquote. And finally, asking a manager to be present for difficult workplace conversations that could be triggering. I'm beginning to see a theme here. Let's break them down. First, he wanted a different studio because he didn't get along with somebody. It could be because he's a jerk, but instead he blames it on what he perceives as someone else's attitude toward addiction recovery. Then he asks for resources to cope with a stressful work environment. He didn't specify what those resources might be. As for the third request, that should have been an easy one to accommodate, since it seems nobody wanted to have a one-on-one conversation with him either. But you can't appoint a manager to follow him around all day just in case he gets into a conversation with someone that might turn out to be a trigger for him. His lawsuit is based on his claim that his addiction is a disability, and therefore his employer is responsible for making him feel warm and cozy at work. Otherwise, he'll revert to being a drug addict. The man's attorney pointed out that it is the employer's responsibility to develop accommodations for those that ask for help, according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. But is addiction really a disability? Are all addictions disabilities? Do I get special accommodations at work if I'm addicted to gambling? Someone with one arm or one leg has a disability. I only have one working ear. Is that more or less of a disability than drug or gambling addictions? Could I compel the radio stations I work for to broadcast in mono instead of stereo because stereo broadcasts give me anxiety? Unlike a drug addict, I took no action to cause my disability. It's not like I went over my Ozzy Osbourne quota so my ear shut down. But this guy in Colorado claims his drug addiction and his HIV are disabilities, both of which are most often caused by your personal behavior, because of choices you made. I guess there's a chance you could be born with HIV and addicted to crack, but it's not likely. He's worked at the radio station for 9 years, pretty much since he got sober in 2015. So for the past 9 years, he's been fighting the urge to smoke crack again. If you can go 9 years without it, you must have some strength hidden somewhere. You've obviously learned how to avoid your substance of choice. You've developed good habits and adopted a healthy lifestyle that allows you to live a normal life. But because you got fired, you now claim your former employer didn't provide you with special favors. Guess what, pal? We all have special needs. Yours are just a bunch of self-inflicted bullcrap. In the lawsuit, this asshat claimed the radio station accused him of using his recovery for manipulation. Well, if he wasn't doing it then, he certainly did it when he filed the lawsuit. Checkmate. Just last week, the former podcaster and weekend host came to a settlement. The lawsuit will be rescinded. So, who won? Was it the antisocial jerk who played the victim? Was it the liberal public radio station that has since laid off 15 more people because of budget constraints? I'll tell you what they said, and you can decide for yourself. The radio station was tight-lipped and didn't go into any detail, telling the Colorado Sun only that the matter has been resolved, and said it encourages the former employee in his future endeavors and his continuing efforts to educate the community. The complainant's statement reads, "I am pleased to announce that the dispute involving me and my former employer, Colorado Public Radio, has been resolved," he said in a written statement. Additionally, and with my gratitude, CPR is supporting me and my efforts to produce future episodes of the podcast. My interpretation of all that is the radio station agreed to let him use a studio, but they won't be hiring him back. Plus, he'll have to produce the program himself. Plans for that, said the former host, will be announced at a later date.
Let's go back through the listening tube for This Week in History.
This week in 1930, Mohandas K. Gandhi was arrested, as were thousands of his followers, resulting from riots in major cities around India. The British Army and Indian police teamed up against the population, who had had enough of British rule. It's important to point out here that Mahatma Gandhi preached civil disobedience and did not support violence. But violence there was, from both Hindus and Muslims, against the British. Gandhi claimed from his jail cell that the violence didn't come from his followers, but acknowledged that no great end has been achieved without incurring danger. But Gandhi learned in 1919, when he saw British soldiers massacre what was described as a mob of Indians, that violence wasn't the answer. Mahatma Gandhi, the former South African lawyer, created civil disobedience. One of the reasons Gandhi's civil disobedience worked was the overwhelming support it had. Most of today's protests are small but loud. It's okay to try to get support for a belief you may have, but at some point, if you don't have the support you thought you were going to get, or the opposition is already larger than your side of the issue, you have to cut bait and move on. Something to consider when you're trying to garner support for your cause is whether violence and radical activism might sway people who support your cause from joining in. I'm sure there were those who were convinced that Gandhi's civil disobedience wouldn't work, but it did. Not because of force, not because it was the loudest, not because it had the most financial backers. It worked because it had overwhelming support, and it was non-violent.
You can hang your hat on that.
This week is Memorial Day in the United States of America. It's a day we take to recognize those who gave their lives in war to protect the people of the United States and promote freedom around the world. Many of us also remember our family members who passed away. It can be as somber a holiday as you wish, but it's also known for two other things: grilling and the Indianapolis 500. Both have changed a lot over the years, but our race cars have outpaced our grills when it comes to technology and performance. Car racing continued to flourish during the Great Depression, and the average speeds continued to climb. Indy cars and the rules of racing were different back in the day. It was this week in 1933 that the Indianapolis 500 had perhaps its worst day ever. You see, back then, it wasn't just the driver in the car. A mechanic also accompanied the driver. That's why more people died that year than any other. In 1933, 5 people died participating in the Indy 500. 2 were killed during a practice run the day before the race, a driver and a mechanic. Then, during the race, 2 drivers and a mechanic were killed in separate crashes. According to Wikipedia, 1 on lap 79 and the 2 on lap 132. If you're a race car fan, you might be thinking, wow, sucks to have that many red flags. 'Cause, They had to stop the race to clean up the debris and collect the remains of the deceased. But like I said, things were different back in 1933. Louis Meyer eventually won the race, beating the next closest finisher by over 6 minutes. Plus, he lived to tell about it. Today, as I'm sure you know, the death of a driver or anyone in the pit crew would end the race. Any race, at any track in the United States. Here's a question to ponder. Do those who compete in such events want the race to continue? Is continuing the race a reflection of American values? Can empathy for the victim be withheld until after the race is finished? What damage is done by continuing the race after the death of a participant? And who benefits by canceling the rest of the race?
The listening tube will return at the speed of sound. Contact the listening tube by calling 570-601-1101 or email thelisteningtube@outlook.com.
I hope you never have to post bail for any reason. I also hope you never feel the need to hire a detective to track your spouse. But it's good to know it's there if you need it. My guest on the program this week is Ken Good. He's a bail attorney and board member of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. Unlike some Texans, Ken is fully aware that there are other states in the country too. So he's not just well-versed on Texas law, but also bail laws in other states. Mr. Good was kind enough to let me ask some questions I had about bail laws. Maybe you have some of the same questions. Now, you're a board member of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. Are there any bondswomen?
Oh, a lot of them. Our president currently is a woman. Many of our directors and executive board team are women. So the bail bond industry in Texas is well represented by men and women and all the different racial groups as well.
Now, why do we have bond? What's the purpose? How did it all come about?
A bond is what is the assurance that you're going to give to the court that you're going to return upon release to answer the charges that have been filed against you. You know, at one point in time in our history, back all the way to England, you know, they didn't have to release you if you were charged with a crime. They could hold you. And then if the king never had a trial, you would stay there the rest of your life and you would die there. So when we had the Magna Carta in England get passed, that was the first time the king allowed restrictions on his ability to hold somebody pre-conviction. And so that concept of certain people have a right to release dates all the way back to the Magna Carta. And so what we currently use, the private surety bail system, is the assurance you're going to give to the court that you're going to return.
And was the original purpose of it to prevent the authorities from taking advantage of the lack of it?
To prevent people from no, I don't think there was anything from the authorities to take advantage. I think, you know, you had to give an assurance, and if you weren't willing to give an assurance or not able to give an assurance, then you stayed in jail. So, you know, this whole concept of we have to review criminal histories before setting bail, that's probably the very most important thing we can do, because I think your past actions are the best predictor of whether you will be a problem in the future for committing another crime. Because our concept of public safety is that if you are not willing to follow the rules, if you're not willing to abide by the law, if you're not going to allow public safety or in our community, because you're going to still commit crimes, then that's one of the things that's taken into consideration on setting your bail. That's the problem with this whole concept of simple release that we're seeing that's being tried in our urban areas. Simple release is release without anything. It's no promise, it's no security, it's nothing. It's just your word. And I think originally we were told, oh, well, everybody wants to resolve their case, so they'll all want to come back. That's been absolutely proven wrong. And I think the most recent studies are showing that without accountability, it's being perceived as a green light to commit more crime. And that's exactly what's happening. Crime is going up as a result of these simple release mechanisms.
Other than money, are
Mhm.
there other types of bond?
Well, I would say, are there other types of release that states use? And so, like in Texas, we have three types of release. We have a surety bond, and they don't post the whole month, the whole deal. It's a bondsman posts a bond saying, we will guarantee, like an insurance policy, we'll guarantee that they'll come to their court appearances. If they don't, then we'll pay the bond amount. Uh, we have a cash bond where they put up the total amount of the bond in cash, and the surety is the cash itself. And then the third type of release we recognize in Texas is a personal bond, which I think falls into that category of simple release. You're being released on your own promise. In Texas, we define a personal bond as a bond without surety. So even if it's a personal bond for $10,000, that's the amount, but it's only your promise. So it's your promise to pay instead of a surety's. And, like Harris County doesn't collect personal bonds. So it's a simple release. And then other states have other things that they add on top of that. So like California would call simple release on zero bail. So your bond is zero. So you're making a personal promise. You have no surety. It's a zero bond. In New York, they call it released on no bond. So you're just being released without a bond. And then in Illinois, we were using surety bonds that got taken away probably more than 10 years ago. And all this, we've been hearing in the news in the last couple of months about they've ended cash bail. It's cash bonds or paying for the premium to the court. The problem with that is the courts were using that to fund court operations for a certain percentage. And so that now they've taken that away. And so the courts are really desperate because they didn't replace that funding. And so you've got chaos all over the place in Illinois. Courts don't even have the money for operations, and they've ended any accountability. So that's the reason why you're having so much crime increasing there. And there's other things that have been tried in other states, but that's kind of a good summary. I would say you have the private industry, and then you have these simple release mechanisms that may be called different things in different states.
Now, is bond unfair to the people who can't afford it?
Unfair. That's a good question. That's an argument we hear all the time right now, but that's not the argument that they initially made. Their first argument was we have to change the way we release people because the current system is going to be declared unconstitutional. We now have had two courts of appeals do the opposite, say it is constitutional. And so so that's the next argument that's being made, and that's the current argument, is that the private system of using a private surety is not fair. And I disagree with that because our system of criminal justice isn't based on fairness because we're not going to treat everybody the same. If you're arrested and you're a first-time offender, we want to only impose the smallest amount of pressure on you to get you to change your actions. Once you're arrested a second or a third or a fourth time, that pressure on you has to go up because you've shown that wasn't enough. And then if you continue, ultimately you're a career criminal. Well, the problem we have is, this fairness argument says we need to treat everybody the same. Well, the criminal justice system wasn't intended to treat everybody the same. If you've got a 20-year criminal history, then you have a high bond set, not because, well, you have a high bond set because of your criminal history. The fact that you can or cannot afford it at that point doesn't have anything to do with fairness. It doesn't have anything to do with your ability to pay. It's because you have a criminal history. And I don't think that violates fairness. That's what we rely upon to keep the public safe.
If a court sets a bail amount for a defendant, then it's up to the bail bondsman to decide whether or not it's worth the risk to help them post that bond.
Yes. When the court sets the bond, you don't have bondsmen just climbing all over themselves to go post it. They're being contacted by family members or by the defendant themselves, asking them to post the bond. And then different bondsmen have different levels of risk they're willing to take. I know bondsmen that won't post certain bonds because they don't like those. They're they're alleging crimes that they just don't like. So they're not going to post a bond for those people because they've been accused of a crime that they can't support. And so they don't want them on their bond. And so, yes, I agree with that. Then the bondsman, after being contacted by either the defendant or the family, decides whether they're willing to post that bond.
Is it unusual for someone accused of a capital crime to be granted bond? Because as a bondsman, I think certainly one of the things I would not want to get involved in would be someone who could be sentenced to life in prison or death for the crime that they committed. That's probably the greatest risk a bondsman would ever see.
Well, you're asking about capital murder. And so
Right.
in the Texas Constitution, under Section 11, I believe, Article 1, Section 11, it talks about a person's right to bail. So, and the Texas Constitution protects your right to a surety bond unless you're accused of one of several crimes that are specifically set out in the Constitution. And for those crimes, you can have bail denied and you can be held in jail until the time of your trial. One of those is capital murder. And so historically in Texas, if you were accused of capital murder, you were normally denied bail because it's one of those offenses. The problem we've been having is with these bad bail reform measures, these pushes that we've seen, especially in our urban areas. Not only have we seen bail set, we've seen people released on personal bonds, on these simple release mechanisms. We've had several instances in Houston and Harris County where somebody was released on either a personal bond or a low bond for murder or capital murder charges, and then they were arrested again for another murder or capital murder. And so, I mean, I've started making the argument that in Houston, you get one free murder before you're going to be held in court. And so I would say one of these things that we've seen is this push for bad bail reform is a push to release violent people accused of violent crimes on bail, which historically they would not have been. And I think that's a bad thing.
Bail laws are, I would imagine, broken down by state and then again by county. But now you're also saying some metropolitan areas have control over bail laws as well. How does that work?
In Texas, bail law is governed by the state legislature. So I would say that predominantly the states regulate bail. Where we've seen these irregularities come in is like, look at California. They passed a referendum where we're going to change certain felony crimes to misdemeanor. And the argument was this will help these people get a job. And so they'll still have to answer for their misdemeanor crimes. But one of the crimes that they changed from a felony to a misdemeanor was theft under $950. And then in our urban areas, the prosecutor, the district attorney, enacted a policy that says we are no longer going to prosecute theft under $950. So it's gone from a felony to a misdemeanor to not being prosecuted. The concept there is that the district attorneys have the discretion to decide, hey, we're just so busy, we can elect not to prosecute certain crimes. Well, they're doing it now across the board in those urban areas. And that's where you're seeing crime just take off. You're seeing businesses close, and it's become a public safety issue. And then in other areas, it's a little bit different. Like in Texas, the only local area that's doing it differently than what the state requires is Harris County, and for misdemeanors. And that's because there was a federal lawsuit where the county did a kind of a good old boy settlement where they changed the law and agreed to follow a different set of rules. And even though that case has now been reversed and the Fifth Circuit has said it should have never been filed in federal court, the local politicians are continuing to follow the settlement. And so I would say that that is an aberration. They've since changed the law even further in Texas, and they're ignoring the changes for misdemeanor bonds in Harris County. And they're doing that because nobody's called them on it. And until somebody calls them on it, I think it will continue. But ultimately, it'll change because it's not working, and it's putting a huge stress on the criminal justice system.
You seem to be well versed with bail laws in other states as well as Texas. Are you having trouble keeping up with bail reform changes? Is it a chore?
Well, no, I'm not going to say it's a chore because what we see is changes are made. They are a catastrophe, and then they come back and revise it. So Alaska undid their reforms. We've had other states undo their reforms. Look at New York. They passed reforms probably 4 years ago. They've now done 3 or 4 rounds of rollbacks. California tried to do a referendum where they got the voters to address the issue of whether they were going to do a statewide reform to these bad policies, and it failed. And so LA County's trying to go around the voters and do it anyway. And so I would say we're seeing more rollbacks, but we're also seeing, the pendulum swings one way and then it eventually starts swinging the other way. And so it's started swinging the other way, but the extreme on the right is to this argument for just preventative detention, which is kind of like the federal system. We just don't have the capacity in the states to hold everybody, and that's a trap. And so I'm trying to point out those issues to legislatures when they come up and start wanting to enact a release or detain system.
You had mentioned earlier that personal recognizance releases or personal the types of releases that don't have the capacity or possibility of raising any money have led to court systems running out of money.
That's Illinois.
I would imagine that bail was originally begun to benefit those who have been charged with a crime, but may be innocent, so they can stay free until their case is adjudicated. But it sounds to me like another benefit of bail laws is the money it generates for the court system. Bail policy.
I mean, the real benefactor of the private surety bail system is the public, because it doesn't cost anything to the county, doesn't cost anything to the state, and it has the lowest failure to appear rate. So if I tell judges, if you want your defendants to show up for court, then you want more private surety bonds to be used. If you don't care whether your defendants show up for court, then you don't need us. You don't need the private surety bail system. And because the failure to appear rates of these different release mechanisms are vastly higher. Misdemeanors using simple release in California have an 80% failure to appear rate. Misdemeanors in Harris County right now have an 80% failure to appear rate. If you have an 80% failure to appear rate, you can't get cases resolved unless you just dismiss them. And so that's what we're seeing. The majority of cases are being dismissed on misdemeanor cases because no one's going to court and you can't make them anymore in those jurisdictions.
Maybe I may have misunderstood you then. How are the court systems you spoke of earlier losing money? Or
Illinois at one time relied heavily on the private surety bail system. And so at some point they got rid of them and said, hey, we're going to cut out the middlemen and allow them to just pay that premium to the court, and then we'll give them a simple release. So they shifted that money going to the court. There wasn't a private surety bond system in Chicago or Illinois after that, and they were just paying to the courts. That's how those courts got dependent upon those funds. And in addition to that, they're relying upon people's failures to come to court for that money. That's what was taken away just recently. So the courts have now even lost that. They haven't replaced that funding. And again, that release mechanism has a much higher failure to appear rate than the private surety bail system. That takes away accountability. You can't hold them. So your case backlogs keep building and building and building. So what do? You end up dismissing the cases. And so that's what we're seeing, is that's what creates chaos, that's what removes accountability, and that's what destroys the criminal justice system.
So it's the case of the private bail versus public bail systems.
The public bail system is like the worst of the options because they can't do what the private industry does, and then they become heavily reliant upon those funds to fund court operations. So
also sounds like a conflict of interest as well.
Absolutely, it sounds like a conflict of interest. Now we're learning as a result of all these bad policies that have been placed in New York and California. We're learning that the politicians were told when they enacted them that if you do this, crime will increase. And their response was, well, it's okay. We're fine with crime increasing as long as we're addressing our political agenda. And their political agenda was, hey, we're going to address systemic racism. And now here we are 4 or 5 years later. The racial makeup of their jails is still the same. Even if the population number may be down a little bit, the racial makeup is still the same, which shows you that either their policies are complete failures to address systemic racism, or more likely, we didn't have a systemic racism problem to begin
with. That might be likely.
Yeah, well, there's studies that support that.
How does bail reform affect crime statistics?
That is a really difficult question because right now we have this whole discussion and argument about whether crime is increasing or whether it's just a perception. You have the people who are pushing bail reform saying crime's really not increasing, it's just a perception issue. And I've written articles about that. The best statistic on crime is auto theft because insurance companies require you to report it before they'll pay it. So you have to get a police report. And those numbers probably are most accurate and they show that they're just going up every year and it's scary. And if you're not going to hold anybody accountable for stealing the car and you're just going to dismiss a case against them or never file it and then say crime is going down because we've now made that in our minds no longer a crime, that's not public safety.
And it's not very good statistic keeping either, is it?
No, and that's the reason why you see politicians now saying, "Oh, crime is not really up. Don't believe what you're seeing, believe us." And I think the dam is starting to break on that. I think the realization that crime is actually going up, and they're just have been sold. They're selling a bill of goods because they knew all along that when they did this, crime would increase, and they didn't care because they thought they were addressing systemic racism. But now, with years of experience, we know that the racial makeup of the jail is the same. So either they were wrong or we don't have systemic racism in our criminal justice system like they said.
I'm going to ask a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek question here. How much money are all the Texas bail bondsmen raking in from all of the immigrants who've been put on parole to wait for a status hearing?
None, because that is a different type of bond. That is a bond posted with the federal government. And so you have to be able to post immigration bonds. And so the private surety bail system in Texas doesn't make not one single dollar from that system.
You said a federal bond.
Yes,
How
an immigration bond.
how does that work? I've never heard of this before.
Well, to post an immigration bond, you have to be authorized to post them with I think, the Department of Treasury. And so it's not, I mean, it is not a surety bond, it's an immigration bond. And so it's a different mechanism. And I think a lot of these people that you're talking about that are coming over the border are being released without bond. They're not being required to post an immigration bond. And, the bonding system in Texas, they can be deported if they're here illegally. So if you're arrested in Texas and you're here illegally, if I post a bond, you will get out of jail, but then be handed over to immigration to be deported. So and then if you get deported and you don't show up for court, I'm going to pay 100% of that bond to the court. So the bondsmen have zero incentive to post a bond for somebody here's that's illegally. And usually it happens because the family lies to them and says they're here legally.
Now, I haven't read every state's bail laws, but one thing in Texas bail law that stood out to me was charitable bail organizations.
Yes,
Do
sir.
other states have similar organizations and laws to govern them?
I would say historically, no. Texas was the first state. So 2 sessions ago, they were the first state to enact regulations governing charitable bail funds. But Texas didn't put any restrictions on what they can do. They just made it a transparency issue. They had to get a certificate from the county clerk. They had to post an affidavit saying who could file cash bonds because a charitable bail fund just files cash bonds. And then after they let somebody out of jail, they have to file monthly reports with the sheriff notifying them of how those people are doing, whether they're showing up for court. Since Texas did that, other states have looked at putting regulations on charitable bail funds. Indiana put restrictions on who they can bond out. Since they say they want to do low level people, they restricted it to low level people. And that went up on appeal and was upheld. Georgia just enacted a new statute that limited charitable bail funds to posting 3 bonds in a year. So that effectively would put them out of business. And you're going to see more of that because, the charitable bail funds are mostly new as a result of what happened to Mr. Floyd several years ago. They raised huge amounts of money and they didn't need it for the people that were arrested at those protests. They were released and they never had charges filed. So the problem is since then, they've been looking for people to bond out and they found there's nobody sitting in jail languishing for just a couple of $100, like we've always said. So they've been bonding out the worst of the worst, the people that their families no longer will bond them out. That's what's gotten them in trouble. And so you're seeing restrictions put on them so that they can no longer bond out the worst of the worst.
Mr. Good, any advice for someone who needs to be bailed out of jail?
Well, the system will have an opportunity for you to address the court. I would say if you have family and friends that are involved, you're not going to have any trouble getting out of jail. I would say, my advice to you is follow the law. And if you're a first-time offender, you're not going to have any trouble getting out of jail. You're going to have friends and family. Anybody will bond you out. But if you're going to go down the road of a career criminal, you're going to have problems. And if you can't fit into society and you can't conform and find a way to become productive without breaking the law, then you're going to have more and more problems in the bail system because you're going to have more and more criminal justice system problems. The criminal justice system, anything good for it is usually good for the bail system because they're so intertwined. The private surety bail system is the number one way we get people to court and provide supervision before pretrial. That's done, I think, effectively. So if you get rid of the private surety bail system, you're getting rid of your best pretrial supervision and the people that have an incentive to make sure you go to court. And that's what happens. You get chaos, you lose accountability, your failure to peers go up, your case backlogs go up, and then the pressure to dismiss cases takes over.
Is there anything I didn't ask you, that anything else you would just like to add to our conversation?
People have asked me, what's the compromise on these bad bail reform measures? And I really wonder if there is a compromise here, because if people who are enacting policies know that it will increase crime, and they want to do it anyway for a policy that is not even real, and then they're going to lie about it to say crime is not increasing when they knew it was going to, and now they're just trying to hide it to extend what they're doing. It's hard to find a compromise. But after saying all that, I am hopeful because the ship is being righted in a lot of these states. When you start doing things for the wrong reason, the public realizes it. And the public demands public safety. And if the state or the county is not willing to give it to them, then they will demand it in other ways. And the politicians will stand up and realize. And I would just kind of end with saying, we've been through this before. We went through this in the 60s where we felt safe. We became more forgiving on our criminal laws. We started releasing more people from the jails, and we had the same thing happen. We had crime increase, and we had people recognize crime was increasing and say we need to tighten the laws back. And we had one particular side of the debate say, no, we won't agree to it. And it ended with a backlash. And we had the war on crime with Ronald Reagan. And we're going down that same road. We are right in the middle of that same cycle where we've done things, crime has increased, and we have one side of the debate refusing to do anything or only doing something that, with a gun to their head or reluctantly, and they're lying about whether crime's increasing. So we're going down the same road.
You can learn more about bail law at pbtx.com, Professional Bondsman of Texas. pbtx.com. There, you'll find a blog and podcasts about bail laws, case studies, and more. Thanks to Ken Good for spending his time with us today. The Listening Tube is written and produced by yours truly. Copyright 2024. Thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. Subscribe today. I'm your host, Bob Woodley, for Thou Ad Infinitum.
Robbing people with a 6-gun, I fought the law.